Maybe we'll address the first questions towards you before you log off. So let me open the questions to the audience. I think we have one.
Dr. Srini, thank you very much. Are you hearing me? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. And thank you very much for the presentation. You have mentioned that in UK they are using the OLS approach, while in Europe they are using DEA approach for benchmarking. As you know, you are an economist, and the OLS give you average trend. It's not the best practices. However, the DEA gives you the frontier. So how are you addressing this? And the second part of the question, OLS type of approach, you need to have a function on the productivity and the relationship. When you have multiple variable output and multiple input output, how you address them in OLS? And it's easy done by DEA, but not so easy in traditional, what we call the it's not easy by OLS approach. Can you highlight the differences here, please?
No, I'm happy to. I just wanted to check if Tony has any immediate points on those, or should I go first?
Let's
Okay. So I think, it's a very interesting.
one second,
question.
sorry. We're going to collect a few questions for you so you can answer them as a package in a sense, yeah? Any questions for Dr. Srini? Anyone else? No? All right, go ahead.
Right. It's a very interesting question, Professor Ibrahim. So the first question is, why does the UK regulator, despite being regulated since 1980, since 1980s they've been regulating, why do they still use these very archaic methods like OLS for performance assessment? And why are the European regulators, the mainland European regulators, a lot more adventurous in terms of using efficiency tools, right? And to me, this is to do with the academic advisors to the regulator, right? So, regulators are economists themselves, but they also need some support, some scientific support and advisory. So when regulation came into place in the 1980s, the UK regulator, Ofcom, the Office of Communications, the telecommunications regulator, the energy regulator, they were all advised by econometricians, so professors of economics or econometrics in universities. Mainly University of Warwick, there's a well-known professor, Mark Stewart, who advised these regulators. And he's not an efficiency expert, but he's an econometrician. So he is more familiar with OLS in terms of what that does. And of course, he's able to understand it better. So that was the starting point. And of course, it's since then there have been other other advisors and of course other views expressed in terms of there are multiple methods that exist, but there has been a lot of resistance. I have to admit that in the UK, change in regulation has been relatively slow. Because the sectoral issues are quite complex. So the regulators need to be really careful as to what the unintended consequences could be of changing any part of regulation. And if something is working broadly okay, they don't tend to fix it. So they've been pretty much following OLS. But I do have to say that there's no consistency even among UK regulators. So when you take the transport regulator, for example, Office of Rail and Road, they use SFA and DEA for regulating. Stochastic frontier analysis, data mapping analysis. And of course, European regulators, I think they've been advised more by efficiency experts, and they are kind of introduced to efficiency techniques much earlier when, since regulation started. So they didn't need to change, it's just that they were exposed to these methods right at the beginning by efficiency experts. So to me, that is one reason why there are these differences in approaches. Before I take the next question, which is on the functional form relationship, any thoughts from Tore, Tony, as to why there are differences in methods?
Just a follow-up question there. Just, Srini, hello? Just a follow-up question. Are there any comparative studies or a study to show advantage? I mean, is there any differences between the two approaches? So I don't mind to stick to what I know. If the changes in the performance result is minor, it's not worth it to change the attitude. But if there's a substantial improvement in the recommendation from each approach, then one has to go for the best one. And in this case, are there any best among the two approaches?
I can share with you a study where, so there are, one of the reasons why UK regulators use OLS, for example, some of them, is, it's easier to explain the OLS method. DA is easy to explain, but perhaps OLS or these statistical methods are easier. You can just explain that, oh, this is just a line passing through a scatter of points. It is just trying to understand average behavior. So perhaps in terms of the stakeholder engagement, it's a bit easier to convey what the method is trying to do. And that could be one reason, apart from the academic advisors who support them, why OLS could be used. I can share with you a study which we did, and it's quite an important one because the regulator, the UK energy regulator, they use OLS, but then they overlay to the OLS a number of adjustments to make sure that it reflects efficient performance. And then we did a study where we showed conclusively that actually the judgments they apply, they are actually fine when you look at the average performance in the industry. So when you look at across the industry, how these judgments work, the regulatory judgments, they are broadly fine. But then what it does, it does create winners and losers with the individual companies. And they all cancel out at the industry level. So if you focus on the industry performance, these judgments don't matter. But if you look at individual companies, they make a huge impact. Someone gets over-rewarded, someone gets under-rewarded. And so that is something they need to be careful of. And then they published this report of us. This came out in 2013. I will share with you that paper that may be of interest. Tore, you have the mic, so if you want to.
Yes, in general, it's you cannot say that one methodology is outperforming the others. They have pros and cons, both methods, and whether you should choose one or the other depends on, as Srini said, what kind of consultancy you used at the time you started. Heavily influenced by ourselves, we used Professor Finn Førsen at the University of Oslo, who was a very early DA guy, and his PhD student Gibson as well. But after they have worked through this process and find out that we could use DA for this type of benchmarking for our purpose, and we then asked if we can check out if we can use some more like SFA frontier models, and that was how I came into the sector. And we found out it's more difficulties in practice with the SFA models. They are more vulnerable to wrong data. They can you do not get that stable results at least in the early days when the data was not that. We were not so sure about the data. And then second thing is that, well, in the early days, everyone had heard about regression, and SFA is another way of regressing like OLS. That was common to a lot of people. DA was not, and DA was regarded as a black box. But the first time I learned about the DA was, and it was described in this project, that it was very simple. It's very, very simple and very simple to understand. So it was not a black box. Everyone was told it was a black box, and they thought it was a black box. They never opened the box to actually look into it. It's much more difficult to explain what really happened in a regression analysis and how that impacts the results on one specific company. In DA, it's very simple. You can identify the units that you are compared to, and you can take a stand as a company. You can take a stand. Do this company do the same as I do? That is the pros, and that's why we think that is a good approach. And the industry, they prefer to have it that way compared to use something else.
Let's in line to how many available here for the discussion. If the in UK approach is to identify those who are above and below average, and just to give incentive based on that, it's okay. However, the DA approach is determine the frontier and provide the rank for them. So if you want to identify improvement, that I was talking in my talk, is that then DA is the right approach. However, if you'd like to see, take measures at rand of the sector and identify those who are above or below average, and then give them appropriate incentive, like what you said, 40%, 60%, then it might not make much difference, like I said.
Well, when it comes to SFA or DA, well, these frontier models, well, they identify what we call the efficient frontier, where you could be if you are most efficient. But on the other hand, the way you apply it is, in regulation, you use them to determine revenue caps or price caps. And it doesn't really matter if you do it on an average or at the frontier. When it comes to the incentives, the incentive lays in that your performance actually determine how much revenues you are having, or said another way, the other company's performance decides how much revenue cap you will have. So if you want to get a high revenue cap, you have to increase your performance. Whether you calibrate it to the average or at the frontier doesn't really matter. We can have used any method for our model.
I would like to ask you now the question. I would like, thank you, Srini, for that, but you might inject information later on. In your approach, you said, I use DA to get the frontier, which is fine. Give you efficiency for each company. I agree. Now the question I did not understand from you, how you determine the cap on incentive, and then you said, okay, now if you are going to get 100,000 per year, then you have to work on minimizing your cost. Then to show that you are efficient minimization. So how you determine that cap and that kind of incentives?
I'll try to explain it in a very simple way then. If you think about the standard DA results, which provides figures from 100% to something below, down to 60-70% for the most inefficient ones. Okay, then could you use that result instead if you had a DA result of 80%? This cost norm in our case will be only 80% of your own costs. But that is not what we are doing. We're saying the last stage in the process is calibrating. So what we are doing in the last stage is that those who are, let's say the average efficiency of the industry is 80%. We are calibrating everyone so an average unit will be equal to 100% unit. And 100% unit will be 120% unit. So it's just a calibration so that at an industry level you will have cost norms which is exactly the same as the industry's costs. The intent doesn't come from this the size of the revenue caps, but the fact that they are de-linked from your own costs. And we use DA as a way of de-linking the cost norm from your own costs, if you understand. Because the cost norm is then decided by all the other companies.
Can I add, I don't know if Tony has a point on the, okay. So, I mean, I just want to add to Tore's points, because in terms of incentives, it doesn't matter. You are incentivized to improve performance. If you improve performance, you end up with higher returns, right? So the benchmark is something that's externally set, but, the strength of incentives is anyway there. Now, what some regulators do, and I think it's also done in Norway, is for these frontier performers, the efficient ones you're talking about, Ibrahim, they need to be incentivized further because they are pushing the boundary. They are the ones perhaps innovating and then somehow pushing the frontier for everyone else and then taking the industry forwards. And for these frontier performers, additional incentives, either reputational, financial incentives, they may need to be provided. So in Norway, there is that super efficiency bonus, for example, which also exists in Germany now for distribution operators. So if you are efficient, it's not that you get your money back. There is a possibility of getting 105% or an extra 5% of revenue, to your costs, because you've been doing quite well historically and you've been pushing the industry. So there can be other forms of incentives that can be overlaid as well to incentivize these frontier companies to keep innovating, to keep driving technology and everything forwards. So I think Tore mentioned about smart grid investments, right? That is going to happen. So in the UK, when Ofgem made investments happen for smart grid technology, smart grid meters, 5 years back, they made all the elements for the companies, but then they said, well, in 5 years down the line, I expect better data to have happened, more live information, and that results in additional productivity improvements, technological improvements. So when you have more live data, you can balance the energy load better. You can manage your customer interruptions better. So what the regulator says is, well, I am encouraging certain types of investment, but I want to incentivize also that the companies make use of those investments, those technological progresses as well. So there are, as Tore said, that the vanilla kind of incentive is there. That's fine. You can set it at whatever level you want to. But again, there are other incentives that you can introduce into the framework to force certain kinds of behavior in the markets.
Thank you very much. We had another question earlier, more at a structural level. If regulatory authorities in Denmark, Norway, the United Kingdom are usually independent from political interference. If you could give us your insight on this.
I'll start with Norway. We are NVE, which is the body that I work in, is subordinated to the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy. And we have currently delegated the power from the ministry. The power is given to the ministry in the law, but it's delegated to NVE from the ministry. But we are going to implement the third package in the Energy Directive, EU Energy Directive, and then the regulator has to be independent from the industry, of course, as it is today, but also from, not from the government, but from political decisions.
Politicians. Yeah.
And the way that is solved, we will still be, NV as an organization will still be subordinated to the ministry, but the department, which is the National Regulatory Authority, is established as an independent unit within NVE. And all the decisions made in this unit cannot be overruled by the ministry, whilst all the others can.
Okay. So in effect, there is a healthy level of independence for the
Yes.
regulatory bodies.
And there is also
and it's also going to get more independent with time, is what
Yes.
you're saying. Yeah.
And then there will be like all decisions made by a body that is subordinate to a ministry will normally, if you what do you call it? If you make a legal decision, they can. You can apply for. Sorry. Yeah, you can. You can.
You can file a
Yeah,
charge.
you will normally take it to the. Will be decided by the ministry of what is right or what is wrong, or what should be the right decision.
Whereas if you go through the courts, that's a more independent process.
Well, it will not go to the court. We will set up an independent body that takes that care of that. Because if you're going to take to court, it will be very costly for the utilities to take it there. Well, if you take a independent body, then there will be complaints from
in Lebanon, not only do we not have independent regulatory bodies, but the judiciary is also not independent. So where to begin? Please, Denmark.
The water regulator in Denmark is also independent from political interference and, of course, also from industry interference.
Yep, it's great to hear. I mean, it's no surprise to me, but it's important just to say this for others.
Yeah. We are organizationally we are placed in the in the Ministry of Businesses, Industry, and Financial Affairs. I think it's in English. But the Water Sector Act and the Energy Sector Act and all utilities sector acts are in the ministry. Is the responsibility of the Minister of Utilities, but he cannot interfere
in your decisions.
In my decisions, and also the Minister of Business cannot interfere
in your
our
decisions.
legal decisions.
If we had Lebanese ministers here listening to this, I think they would go pale at what's coming at them. You know. Maybe that's why they're not here.
It's the same thing as Tore said. If
like
the
an ostrich.
companies do not agree with our legal decisions, they have to take it to court. They cannot run to some minister and complain about it because he can do nothing.
Is it part of your authority to give license?
Please. That's on.
Is it under your authority to license, for example, power suppliers or water suppliers or water companies, or whose authority is it?
No, we don't. They don't have licenses as such. They have a duty to supply, but it's not a license. Each water company has. Yeah.
Because you mentioned private companies.
Yeah, but they're not private as they cannot. It's not private like a private sector.
Okay.
It private means in the water sector in Denmark. It means that they are owned by those who are receiving the water. So it's consumer owned. Yeah. So you can. It's not an option. It's not possible to
It's owned by the
make
people.
revenues
as a private individual.
No, you cannot earn money on water or wastewater in Denmark. It's impossible.
All right. Would you like to add anything?
Water. Should I apply for the ministry to give me, or should I go to the regulator who approve giving me the license to distribute water or electricity, whatever? So who is in charge? And let's say we have in Lebanon what we have. We have a lot of small companies producing electricity from generators. So we have thousands of them due to the lack of government provision. So they mushroomed by nature. Now the government interfering by setting prices. It should not the ministry. You should provide yourself. And you don't have a regulatory board that's independent from the ministry who can set prices or motivate people.
The law is there. The law is there, but it's not applied.
We have monopoly. No, we have monopoly in the generation and distribution given the ministry.
regulatory framework, but some they're not applying it. That's the thing.
Okay, I can try to explain how it works in Norway, because you have this, well, we have generators, we have suppliers, we have distribution system operators, we have power exchanges, and all of them have licenses in one way or another, different types of licenses. If we go for generators and distribution system operators and transmission operators, they need a license to be allowed to build a technical installation. So they need permission to build. And in that process, you take care of all environmental issues regard to the building of infrastructure. And since we are hydro, we also need a license for utilizing the water. So you cannot just use the water without having a license, because it's a common good. For a supplier which doesn't have any assets except for a computer, he will need a trading license, which is just a license so we can register that he's actually in the business, so we can collect data from him. And we can, if we don't perform in a proper way, we can.
Then the question, you said, okay, it was very clear so far. I buy electricity, he produces electricity, I buy it and sell it to you. Now the network is owned by the government.
No, it's in Norway.
And how can I sell on the public that I did not participate in it, but I am using it to distribute electricity to you and her? And let's assume you are two competing companies. You are her neighbor, you are using company A, company B. What? I'm using the same network. How could it work?
Well, if you're using the same network, you are a part of this. You are belonging to the same distribution system company. So you will have the same.
Unless you aggregate the electricity supply and then you get the bill based on it. Now you are going to. So we can, as a government, you are provider, I'm provider. We are using the same channel. So I can get your metering and her metering and pay you according to my prices. But I will be using the same network to combine electricity by that could be working as well.
But the power price is billed separately, and the use of the
That's very interesting. Thank you very much to all the panelists and to AUB and Professor Osman.
Before you go, we will give you your personal gift, a token of appreciation for your hard work. Start going to Norway.